Hello everybody, my name is Mo. I'm back here again. I'm talking about, been reading the book here. If you've ever seen this book before, it's the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, a book that he wrote. I'm looking at chapters 2 and 3 I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I'm just going to give you a rundown, a list of things that I read while I was looking at those chapters. Here's some things from chapter 2. On his plantation, his master's family, the master had 2 sons. Their names were Andrew and Richard. He had a daughter. Her name was Lucretia. On the plantation that Frederick was living on, the main crops that they grew were tobacco, corn, and wheat. He talks about some slaves being privileged. Some slaves felt that other slaves were privileged on the plantation. He says that if a slave got out of line, I guess if they did something wrong that the master felt was, really bad, they would be sold very quickly, made an example out of, and sent to Baltimore. Food rations per month for a slave, he says, each month you got 8 pounds of pork or fish on the plantation, and you got 1 bushel of cornmeal. Yearly clothing. He talks about clothing that he got, that they used to get. And this was mostly adults. They got 2 linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers, 1 pair of trousers for winter, 1 jacket, 1 pair of socks per year. And they got 1 pair of shoes. This stuff is supposed to last all year long. He says the children were actually went naked most of the year, and they, if lucky, I guess they would get like a big shirt that maybe cover them up, but it's very common like to see them naked. He talked about the living situation in chapter 2. He says they slept on the floor. Most of the time it was cold and damp on the floor. Every day in the plantation, they were working on those farms or whatever they were. They were woke up by a horn that the overseer used to blow. He says if you didn't hear the horn, then you would get whipped. If you missed the horn, or if you didn't get out there like in time after the horn was blown and you took too long to get out there, you were given a beating for it. One of the overseers on the plantation, his name was Mr. Severe. That's kind of an appropriate name because they say that he was a violent overseer and he loved to whip the slaves. Some of the jobs that the slaves did on the plantation, Frederick says, some were blacksmiths. They did cart riding, coopering, weaving, and grain grinding. So that's kind of like a summary of chapter 2. Like I said, that's not everything that happened in chapter 2, but that's some of the things that he talked about. Here's a little bit about chapter 3. In chapter 3, he talks about the fruit farm. That was like one of his master's prized possessions was this fruit farm that he had, all these different trees and fruits and things like that. I guess people from all over the area used to come in just to look at it. It was such an amazing fruit farm. It was a sight to see, he says. He says that if a slave was caught picking some fruit off the master's trees, you would get whipped for it. They even got to the point where the master had the fences tarred. The fruit garden was fenced in, and they put tar all along the fence. And if you were found with any of that tar on your shirt or clothing, you would be severely whipped because they would just assume that you went into the fruit farm, even though you may not have. Maybe somebody pushed you into the fence and you just got tar on you. He talked about someone named Colonel Lloyd, who was also on the plantation. His most prized possession, this guy adored his horses, loved his horses. In fact, the slaves it was kind of a privilege to take care of his horses. But the thing is, if Lloyd felt that his horses weren't being taken care of properly, he would severely whip the slaves because of this, because he thought they weren't treating them right. If a horse seemed like his head was too low or wasn't performing correctly, he would assume that the slaves were not doing what they're supposed to do. He talks about a time a guy named Old Man Barney. This guy was an older black man, I don't know, 50, 60 years old, was in charge of taking care of these horses. And one of the horses wasn't performing the way that the master thought he was supposed to. He made this guy get on his hands and knees, made him take off his hat, and the master proceeded to, or the overseer proceeded to, give this guy 30 lashes on top of his head. He also talks about in the chapter how slaves used to argue about, on different plantations, whose slave master treated them the best. Like, they would argue about, well, my slave master is richer than yours, or my slave master is nicer than yours, or he treats us better, or he's better, or our slave master is better at riding a horse. And this would actually cause fights between slaves. They argued about their slave masters. One of the things that they talked about was that as a slave, Frederick talks about, as a slave, you could not, if someone asked you a question about how did your slave master treat you, even if you thought he treated you bad, you had to say that he treated you good, or you risked being punished severely. In fact, he talks about sometimes there were people actually sent amongst the slaves, white men sent amongst the slaves for this purpose, just to ask how the slave owner treated them, how he fed them. And even if he treated them terribly, and you said that he did, if you gave a yes, you would be severely beaten. So they said that most slaves were trained. They were trained just to say that their slave owner treated them very well. He also talked about the way, if you were a slave and you encountered a white man, for example, and they didn't know who you were, the typical slave greeting was, "Well, boy, who do you belong to?" And that was how they greeted the slaves if they didn't know who they were. So that's just a little bit about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, chapters 2 and 3. If you want to know a little bit more, you can read those chapters yourself. I just highlighted some things that I found interesting in those chapters. Once again, my name is Mo, and stay tuned for the next video, which will be probably chapters 4 and 5. Thank you again. Enjoy learning about Frederick Douglass with me.